If you've ever wondered what tools it takes to build nice cabinets yourself, stick with me because I've built a lot of cabinets over the years, and these are the tools that I find save me a lot of time and headaches. And I'm even going to call BS on some products that I think are a total waste of money because there are other free ways to do a better job. Every cabinet project basically begins the same way. You've got the design down, the measurements all set, and then it hits you. Somehow you've got to get all these plywood sheets into the shop. And I'm sure you're aware, those all come in 4x8 sheets, which weigh a not insignificant amount. So I can't say this is a must-have tool for cabinet making, but I'm guessing that a lot of you are like me and you work all alone in your shop, and carrying sheet goods around can be sketchy at best sometimes. This tool makes it a whole lot easier. The Gator Lift works by sliding these grippy clamps over the edge of your sheet and lifting up on the handle. Now I can hoist it up onto my shoulders and magically that 75-pound sheet is on the move. It's got a rubberized gripping surface so you don't have to worry about it slipping off mid-carry, and it works with sheets up to 1 1/8 inch thick. It's like having a friendly alligator in the shop. You know, one that's interested in helping you carry stuff, not biting your arm off. Now that I have my plywood where I want it, I need a place to cut it. And people typically go one of two ways with this. They either Jason Hibbs that thing up onto the table saw like some kind of woodworking cowboy, or they use the good old garage floor, a place where sawdust, wolf spiders, and sore knees live. Neither of those options sounds really appealing to me, so I went with option C. I bought a centipede work holder, which is an expandable platform that can be used for all kinds of things really, but one thing I find it most useful for is cutting sheet goods. Somehow this thing is rated for 6,000 pounds, and I have no idea how they tested that, but this guy tested it by lifting his tractor off the ground. And I don't really care if it's true or not, because I know it's more than capable of holding a full sheet of plywood, as well as a full meat, which is all I'd ever ask it to do. This thing gives you a stable, portable work surface that requires almost no time to set up. One of my favorite tips is to use a piece of pink foam insulation as a layer between the centipede and the plywood. The foam not only provides a sacrificial layer that you can cut into without worrying about damaging your saw blades, but it also prevents you from cutting the supports. It's like giving your plywood a comfy mattress to lie on while you rip it to pieces. And you can do the same thing with this set of accessory brackets that comes with the centipede. These are to hold 2x4s to support your work, as well as a set of holdfasts, which in theory can hold your work in place. To be honest, I don't find either one of them very useful. I just really like using the pink foam. With this setup, I have full support of my cuts, nothing is going to fall or pinch my blade, and it's all done at a comfortable working height, unlike crawling around on the floor with the spiders. The best part though is that it folds up into a nice compact bundle so you can store it out of the way without sacrificing any valuable shop space. And while we're here talking about cutting plywood, let's address the fact that I'm using a fairly expensive track saw to make these cuts. It's honestly my favorite way to break down sheet goods because I can make perfectly straight, crisp cuts and get amazing dust collection. So, do you have to have an expensive tool like this to make cabinets? No, of course not. But do you want a tool like this to make cabinets? Yeah, you do. I realize I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth here, but hear me out on this. If you get right down to it, cabinet parts are nothing more than a bunch of rectangles assembled together, and a track saw, in combination with something like a rail square, is designed to make perfect straight and square cuts. And if you have an MFT, this can be made even easier. That means you can build cabinets without the need for a table saw, and if you don't have the budget, you can replicate the functionality of a track saw just using a circular saw, which I demonstrated in my last video. It's not a perfect replacement, and it has terrible dust collection, but it can be done. And now there are even more budget-friendly options on the market than there were when I bought mine. So as much as I'd like to say this is a must-have tool, it's not, but it is a very, very, very nice way to do this work. Now that I have all my cabinet parts, I need to cut a notch out of the corner of each of the side pieces to make a toe kick. And to do that, it's going to be pretty simple. I've just got a square and a pencil to mark my layout lines. And then to cut it out, you have a few options. Once I make my layout lines, I like to clamp a speed square to the workpiece, and that gives me a handy guide to run my jigsaw against. When I get one side done, I can switch over and get the other side. And if you're wondering if a jigsaw is the right tool here, well, with a good fine cut wood blade, you're going to get really clean edges on these cuts. That's definitely the cheap and simple way to do it, but it's not the most efficient. There is another way, but you need a bandsaw and this little magical device right here. These little guys have a switch on the top, and when you turn it, it becomes a strong magnet, hence the name mag switch. Just start your cut, and when you reach the end of your layout line, add a mag switch to act as a positive stop. The best part of this method is I only need to make my layout lines on one part, and then the rest I can just bang out lightning fast because the saw is already set up to just repeat that same action over and over. And once I have the first cut made, I can reposition the fence and the mag switch and finish off the notches. So that's two good ways to do this. One just happens to be the cheaper way and the other one more efficient. All right, now with my parts cut, I need to start thinking about joinery, but I don't need to think about it too hard because with every cabinet I build, I pretty much use two types of joints. The first is a dado, which I use to house the bottom panel and the back panel of the cabinet. I also use them for drawer bottoms, but that's a different video. One way to make these is using a table saw and a dado stack, but seeing how I just told you that you don't need a table saw to make cabinets, we need to go another way. And that other way is to use a router. This way is just as fast as a dado stack, but there is one problem to consider. Straight cut router bits typically come in standard sizes like 3/4 inch and 1/2 inch. The problem is plywood doesn't. It's thinner than that. So if you cut your dado using a 3/4 inch bit, this joint is going to come out super sloppy, and we can't have that. We want everything in nice and snug. The good news is they actually make undersized plywood bits, and they typically come in a set of 3 so that you can handle 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch, and 3/4 inch plywood. Even though it's called a 3/4 inch plywood bit, the actual diameter is 23/32 to match the plywood. So now our joint is going to come together nice and snuggy snug, like we know what we're doing. Yeah, that thing's not going anywhere. And for the rest of the assembly, my go-to method might surprise you a little bit. I mean, when you think of custom-built cabinets, you might imagine dovetails or mortise and tenons being used because those tend to be synonymous with craftsmanship and strength. But with cabinets, there's a fine balance to be struck between speed, strength, and cost. And the method that I find fits this profile the best is pocket screws. Cabinets are like the potato chips of woodworking. You never make just one. It's usually an amount that you end up regretting halfway through the project. And for that reason, speed and efficiency matter. I mean, unless you're under no time constraints, in which case, congratulations, you've won life. There are other ways that you can get this efficiency, of course, like the domino joiner, but that comes at a hefty price. A fully kitted out pocket screw system, on the other hand, is 1/10 the price of a domino, and you don't need to wait for the glue to dry. As long as you've got a drill and a clamp to act as a helping hand, you can make these joints. In my opinion, that makes the pocket hole jig very approachable and the prospect of making cabinets that much less intimidating. So pocket screws are both efficient and cost effective, so that just leaves the question of strength. But this video is not about testing joint strength, it's about what tools I use to build cabinets. With a quick search, you're going to find a lot of YouTube videos conducting pseudoscientific tests exploring which joints are the strongest under certain extreme conditions. Most of them involving putting a bunch of force on a single joint, which isn't a real thing in woodworking. But none of those videos address the right question, which is how much strength is actually needed in a real-world application. Well, here's a real application. This bank of cabinets was built just like the one I'm demonstrating in this video with pocket screws. Not only do these cabinets get used daily, but they're holding hundreds and hundreds of pounds of tools and supplies. And these are holding up just as strong as the day that I made them 3 years ago. And for those who say pocket holes are ugly, come here. Do you see any pocket holes? How about here? What about here? Or here? I didn't think so. In my opinion, cabinets were the project that pocket screws were designed to excel at because they hit that trifecta of speed, cost, and of course, real-world strength. Sometimes, though, you'll have situations where you can skip the pocket holes and screw two parts together on the face. This will actually be faster and easier in spots where the screws won't be seen, like inside a cabinet full of drawers. In those cases, though, you want to make sure you drill a pilot hole first because it's very easy for screws to wedge in between those plies and split the plywood ends. You also want to countersink the hole so that the head of the screw sits below the surface. This countersink bit from Amana does both those jobs at once. There's 2 adjustment points on this thing so that you can set the depth of the drill bit itself as well as the depth of the countersink. And being able to do 2 jobs at once is an instant time saver and puts this bit squarely on my must-have list for building cabinets. And one thing you didn't see me use in that example was any type of clamping square. I just don't really find them to be that necessary in basic cabinet construction. My experience has been that if you cut your parts accurately to size and the blade is 90 degrees to the edge, then when you assemble this stuff, it pretty much goes together square. I do check my work periodically with the square just as a sanity check, but clamping squares, at least for this application, are just kind of gadgety and overkill. I do own clamping squares. I've got a really nice set from Woodpecker, as well as these which were made out of plywood and cut out on the CNC. And where these do come in really handy is for extremely complex assemblies where it helps to have an extra hand keeping stuff square on one part of the assembly while I work on another part. But for basic cabinet construction, pass, not necessary. So one thing you'll have to decide is how to handle the edges of the cabinets. You could make face frames out of solid wood or opt to use edge banding. If I'm doing edge banding, I like to use the pre-glued type that you can apply with heat. It's fast to apply, and aside from the iron, I do have this small group of tools that I find helpful in the process. Once the edge banding is applied, I use a small pressure roller to make sure everything is bonded well, and then I use these flush trimmers to clip off the excess on the ends. Then I go back and use the special edge trimmer tool, which trims both edges at once, and it's double-sided so that when the blades on one side get too dull, you can switch over to the other side. And these blades on the inside are replaceable, so once you wear them out on both sides, you can just pop them out and put new ones in. So up to this point, I've walked you through turning raw materials into a cabinet-like box, and the tools I use for that can be used really on anything. But from here forward, everything I'm talking about is very specific to cabinet making. And that's where you can run into lots of jigs, gadgets, and other unitaskers out there on the market, some of which I think are worth every penny, others not so much. First up are door hinge jigs. So for most cabinetry today, the preferred look is to use concealed or Euro-style hinges, which means you need to drill a large pocket for the hinge to set in as well as 2 pilot holes for screws. And you really want to get the placements of these exactly right, otherwise mounting the door is going to be a huge headache and things may never quite line up right. The best jig out there that I've seen for helping with this is one made by Craig. I've had this one for so many years, and I know there's other ones out there on the market, and some are even made of metal and more expensive, but I've never had a problem with this one, so I just keep using it. It's about $30, and it comes with a 35mm Forster bit for making the pockets, and it also has the hole placements for the pilot holes. These cams here set the offset distance because not all hinges have the same offset from the edge of the door. And the bit has a stop collar on it, so you'll always drill consistent holes to the correct depth for this style hinge. So my overall thoughts on this category are, yeah, thumbs up. This is a great jig to have around, especially one that you can find with the Forster bit included. I think that's a great deal. And usually behind a door, you're going to put an adjustable shelf, and you'll need shelf pin holes. This is another jig I've had for years, and it's also made by Craig. It basically works by sitting up against the edge of the cabinet side, you drill a set of holes and then use this locator pin to set the jig in the right place to keep drilling down the side. The drill bit has a stop collar again so that you don't drill too deep and the holes are spaced perfectly. You could make a jig out of plywood that does the same thing. I've done that before, but my experience is that those holes are going to get widened from continuous use and then your hole spacing is going to be off. But these jigs typically come with metal bushings so that doesn't happen. So thumbs up, this is another jig that I definitely recommend you use. One of the things that freaks people out the most is installing drawer slides. And you can tell that's true because of all the jigs that are out there on the market that are supposed to help. First, you have to measure and mark your lines, hopefully accurately. Then use one hand to hold the jig while you clamp it in place, hopefully straight. And then once you install the slides, you have to pray that you can repeat that entire process accurately on the other side. And this jig actually comes in 2 parts. You have to have one for each side of the cabinet. So it's nice until you lose one of these, and then I guess you're only putting drawer slides on one side of every cabinet from now on. And this jig from Rockler solves that problem. I can at least use it on both sides of the cabinet, but it's got this big old D handle that I'm supposed to hold with one hand and somehow not move off my layout line while I use my other hand to use a tiny screw to install the drawer slides. And I think we all know how that's going to go. Well, I got it close. Okay, never mind. That actually wasn't that close. That's like 1/4 of an inch off. Try and try again. And to make this process that much harder, people love using side mount slides because they're cheaper and easier to find, but they have virtually no adjustability. So if I don't get this in the cabinet exactly where it's supposed to be, level and parallel to the slide on the other side, the drawer is never going to operate the way it's supposed to. This is just so much harder than it has to be, though. There is one trick that you can use to make this a whole lot easier. You can get your slide installs perfectly right just using one scrap of plywood. I've showed this method a bunch of times in other cabinet videos, so I'm not going to go into it too much in detail here, but just know that a scrap of plywood not only gives you a perfect ledge to set your slides on, but it makes sure that both sides are perfectly parallel to one another. It's important to start from the top because once you start cutting the spacer, you obviously can't go back. And this method works whether you're using side mounts, under mounts, Euro slides, it doesn't matter. And if you're sitting there watching going, yeah, I don't have any scrap supply, trust me, if you're building cabinets, you're going to have scraps and offcuts from that process that'll work perfectly for this job. So this type of jig, thumbs down. Total waste of money. If you use undermount slides, you probably know that you need to drill this tiny hole on the backside of the drawer so that the locator pin can hold the drawer in place. And there's a jig that you can buy that'll perfectly locate that hole, but it's expensive, plastic, and you really don't need it. An easy way to locate that hole is just take the slide itself, hold it up against the drawer where it would go, and then just tap that pin into the back of the drawer. It's going to leave a little indentation, and that's where the hole goes. No jig needed. One of the last things to deal with when making cabinets is installing drawer and door hardware, and this is one of those little details that can make a really big difference if you're off. And I always use this jig to make sure those holes are in the right location. This is a cabinet hardware jig from True Position. Just like my track saw, this is a premium tool that I've come to love using. It has positive stops on the top and side so that you can set the distance to the center of your drawer front, and these two can be set up exactly the width of your drawer pulls. And this all works together quickly and accurately to place your cabinet hardware. Once you set the jig up, you can blast through all the drawer fronts of the exact same size really quickly without having to stop and measure out each hole location manually. This one from True Position is just top-notch quality. It's made out of aluminum and steel, and it's made in America, so it is a little more expensive. So my recommendation on this jig is not based on the jig, because you're not going to find a better one than this, but rather on what you plan to make. If you plan on making lots of cabinet projects in the future, then this jig is definitely worth having in your shop. If you only plan to do 1 or 2 cabinets ever, then I don't recommend that you spend your money on this because I don't think you're going to get your money's worth out of it. And that's all the tool advice I have for this video. If you want more videos on how to actually build cabinets, I'll have those all lined up for you right here. And until next time, have fun in the shop.